Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Keystone Historic Preservation Grant webinar. Today we'll talk a little bit more about our fiscal 2019 and 2020 program, but I thank you very much for joining us. Today's webinar will discuss briefly the overview of eligibility and important aspects of both the guidelines for both the project and construction categories of the Keystone Grant Program. We'll help you make connections between your application and the PHMC program areas, including the Pennsylvania Statewide Plan and the Certified Local Government Program, share with you evaluation criteria and the selection process that we use for successful grant applications, and give you tips for pulling together a competitive proposal, identifying common pitfalls and deficiencies that we often see in grant applications through our programs. We'll also share expectations for all of our grantees should your application be funded. And then I'll finish with some information about our Community Initiative Award and our hashtag Preservation Happens Here that we like to use, our grantees to use. A quick note that this grant webinar will not cover how to use the Department of Community and Economic Development's single application for assistance. We've prepared a separate webinar available at any time on our YouTube channel, and you can access the link through the PDF of this presentation. Remember, at any time during the application process, additional support and help is available through DCD's Customer Service Center during normal business hours by telephone and by email. We've also built in some links in the program guidelines, fact sheets, and where to go for information within the application itself to help you find any help that you should need throughout the application process. For webinar housekeeping, ordinarily we take some breaks throughout the webinar for questions, but this is a standalone recording, so we will pause briefly but continue along. This is the recording, so you should be able to find it after our January 27th date, and it'll be live for you. For those who are not familiar with us, I'll spend a few minutes to introduce you to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. We are the official agency in the Commonwealth that deals with history and cultural resources. We're divided into 4 different bureaus: the Bureau for Sites and Museums, the State Archives, and of course the State Museum Building, which you might be familiar with in Harrisburg. The Keystone Grant Program is housed within the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office. So keeping in mind that what our agency mission is, we're certainly attracted to certain types of programs and projects for the Keystone Program. Obviously, resources that include interpretive programming, those projects that increase accessibility to historic buildings, and ensure preservation positively throughout communities. The Keystone Grant Program is actually funded through the Keystone Recreation, Park, and Conservation Fund, which is a set-aside in the realty transfer tax. We share this funding stream with other state agencies, so you often will see the Keystone Grant Program name attributed with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources for trail projects and community park and playgrounds, the Department of Education for capital projects at community libraries, and of course with the state system of higher education. The PHMC also uses our share for capital improvements at our own sites, such as Everett Cloister, and we're proud to be part of our 27th year of public grants. Our allocation has grown in recent years, not only from the health of the real estate market, but learning from constituents about the need for public grants. Our executive office has increased our allocation last year, almost doubling it. So we were able to fund about 60% of the requests that we received. So this year's allocation in fiscal year 1920 is just over $2.6 million. We do offer categories of support for both construction projects and planning or pre-development projects. Eligible applicants are nonprofit organizations, generally 501c3 organizations, and public agencies that own and support accessible historic properties, such as colleges, conservancies, historic preservation organizations, historical societies, museums, and of course religious institutions. Entities of local government, both at the county and municipal levels, I will say that PHMC associated properties, state and federally operated properties, and for-profit organizations and individuals are not eligible for funding. And we do often preclude organizations that have access to other Keystone funding streams and encourage them to apply through the main organizations such as libraries and the Department of Education. We do make exceptions if some of those library programs might be for a special preservation project that is of a high level or might not be as competitive within the library program. Other eligibility requirements are those nonprofit organizations must be having in existence for a 5-year period to ensure that they have the capacity to oversee a construction project. And also we earmark building projects in the construction category that the building will be open and accessible to the public on a regular basis, not less than 100 days per year. Obviously, there are some exceptions to this caveat, especially if the building is not currently accessible due to condition, but the applicant should take time within the application itself to include some detailed plans about how, as a result of the Keystone grant, that the building will have more accessibility to the public. Also, one of the key components for eligibility is that the project must be associated with a building that's listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. It doesn't necessarily have to be individually listed. It can be considered contributing to a historic district. The application does ask for its National Register number, so please contact me or anyone on our National Register staff to receive either the official letter or the property's unique number. Remember that we're not asking for the National Park Service's NRIS number, but rather the PA SHPO's resource number in the application. We call it a couple different things here in the office. It's sometimes the BHP key number or the PA SHPO number, but it's a 6-digit number. We certainly can save you a lot of time by not using the NRIS number. That National Park Service system is a little difficult to navigate, and we're really wanting our own internal number. Please remember that just because it might be a locally significant property or located in a locally designated HARB district, that does not necessarily mean that it meets the National Register status. And conversely, we do offer you the opportunity to mention if you're a National Historic Landmark, but not every building in the National Register is considered a landmark, so keep that in mind as well. Requests to the grant program in the planning project category are between $5,000 and $25,000, and in the construction category, $5,000 to $100,000. Both categories require a 50-50 cash match. In-kind matches may not count toward this match requirement, but of course can be recognized in the project budget as an over and above the cash requirement. The cash match is very important, mainly because these are reimbursable grants and not direct awards. So if you're selected for funding, you will submit reimbursement requests quarterly or more often if needed, and receive 50% of those current expenditures. The application process is done through the electronic single application for assistance managed by our sister agency, the Department of Community and Economic Development, which is nice because there is no more on paper submissions. All of the attachments can be uploaded into this system, so you won't have to physically mail anything to our office. It helps to provide a streamlined process for applicants, especially a consistent platform with other grant-making agencies. We have customized the application from the Keystone program, so you may see some differences, especially in the program addendum if you're a common user of the ESA system. One thing I want to make note of, especially if you have used the ESA system in the past, they have migrated the PA login credentials to the new Keystone login. So your information will need to migrate to the new platform, especially if you want access to your prior application information. which is difficult. We've been hearing from the Customer Service Center that some of the migrations, if you're having problems, are taking a fair amount of time to make sure that migration is successful. So I encourage you all not to wait to the last week in February to open your application, but rather at least make sure that you can have access and into the ESA system as soon as possible so that you're not up against the wall by the grant deadline. The ESA system does provide you with some additional assistance, which is very nice, and one of the key reasons why we wanted to switch over to this. You have access to technical assistance with the application through normal business hours with the Customer Service Center. Again, they're available by both phone or call-in system. But there are some challenges with anything. Remember that the program the platform works best in Google Chrome or Internet Explorer. I'm told that those users with Safari or Firefox often have problems in the budget sections, and it might not work as well or smoothly for you there. And also, the ESA system does have a timeout feature. So if you're working too long, generally about 20 minutes on a particular page, it'll time out and it will not save your work. So we certainly recommend, much like we did in our old eGrant system, that those longer text sections may be prepared in like Microsoft Word or another similar program and then cut and paste in the application at a later time. Otherwise, you have to remember to actively save your work by advancing the page. We're often asked about the selection process for our grants in the Keystone program. Please know that all applications are reviewed by internal staff to ensure that the applicants meet eligibility requirements and are associated with a National Register property. But after that, the applications are shared with an outside grant review panel. These panelists are generally well-versed in preservation or construction methodology and are located throughout the Commonwealth. And we do provide them with certain evaluation guidelines, which include the application, including how well it's prepared, planning, is the project adequately planned to ensure that the scope of work is adequate to cover costs, and that there's a strong project team in place who can evaluate all alternatives and make sure the project will be successful. Obviously, they're asked to judge the application on the project itself, whether it's appropriate and sensitive to the historic character of the resource, demonstrate community support and benefit, and that the project is a good use of investment of state funding. We share those evaluation guidelines with all applicants as well. You can find them in the ESA system in the program fact sheet as well. I certainly encourage you to look at them and look at some of the leading questions to make sure that you're preparing your project narrative to answer all aspects of that. The Grant Review Panel does make a recommendation to our full commission on June the 3rd. Obviously, the PHMC does have some funding priorities through the Keystone program. We look for projects that are visible, that will be seen throughout the community, that there's a significant historic resource that's either historically or architecturally significant, and that the project will further the public understanding of its importance, that it's sensitive to the historic resource. Preservation and restoration activities tend to be selected more often by the Grant Review Panel than something that might be a more heavy-handed gut or particularly not preservation project. Those projects that really show a good base of public support and benefit are also those that are attracted to the Grant Review Panel. You have an opportunity to discuss how your project is supported by the public in the project narrative, but you can also attach letters of support in the program addendum that demonstrate that community benefit too. I certainly encourage you to reach out to either organizations that can speak of its significance in the community, or that the program itself is significant and important to those, and that the Commission should support financially the project as well. More importantly, a good component of what is included within the grant application are that all projects have to align with Pennsylvania's preservation plan. This is not necessarily the plan of just the State Historic Preservation Office, but it was compiled with a lot of community interaction and comment, and includes a lot of programs that all projects funded through the Keystone program have to somehow implement and further the goals and action items of our plan. If you're thinking, I've never seen the statewide plan, where can I find it? We certainly have provided you with a link in the application that helps you read through the plan. Also, as part of this webinar, I've sort of created this matrix that outlines those 4 goals and their companion action items to help you be able to find your project within our plan itself. And again, that our is the capital O, it's all of ours together to really help foster historic preservation throughout the Commonwealth. The other aspect that is considered a funding priority this year in our Keystone program is those projects that have support by the certified local government communities. It's one of the key parts of the preservation plan was the need to build some partnerships, and we felt this was a good way to re-energize the certified local government program in Pennsylvania. We kind of felt that the Keystone program was a great way to make sure that we're investing in our partner CLG communities. Not only are projects that support the CLG's program requirements that to maintain their status are encouraged through the Keystone Grant Program, but we also extend special consideration to those projects in organizations that are located in CLG communities. And by support, I don't necessarily mean financial support. They don't need to be part of your funding matrix or by providing matching grants, but those that just have a letter of support from the CLG contact that can show that this is really an important project in their community and they see that as part of furthering their own preservation goals. The application does allow you to confirm that you're located in a CLG community and you have a special spot to upload a letter of support from your CLG contact. We, again, for those who are not familiar with it, there are 45 municipalities in Pennsylvania who are considered certified local governments. There's a link in not only the application, but here that will take you to the page on our website that identify those 45 municipalities and also contact information to reach out to the CLG contacts for to discuss your project more in detail with them. Just to reiterate, the grant program timeline, all applications are due on March the 2nd in 2020. We cannot provide additional time to complete the application. We try to keep an annual deadline so you're prepared and ready for that deadline of March the 1st, which obviously falls on a Sunday this year, so we've extended it to March 2nd to make sure you have access to both grant staff for questions or those members of the customer service center if you're running into last-minute problems. Remember that your grantees are not notified until after the commission meeting has approved the panel recommendations in June. We tend to notify legislators who can reach out to the successful applicants to that they've received an award, but we also follow up with an award letter to the organization or municipality sponsoring the project. Projects may not start until there is an executed contract in place, which we estimate to be September 1st. That's very important. You will not be reimbursed for expenses that fall prior to the execution of the contract. But you do have a full 24 months to implement your project. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the 2 categories as well and the typical projects that we see in those so you have an idea of an understanding of which to apply under. Now remember, an organization or municipality may apply for either, not both, in a fiscal year. Certainly you can have more than one Keystone grants over the lifetime of the Keystone program, but each fiscal year you may only make one application per in either category, so one a year. So under the planning category, remember there are 2 separate applications for both categories. So make sure you're applying for the correct one. They have to be associated with a resource that's listed in or determined eligible for the National Register. And again, these grant awards are slightly smaller than the construction ones. They're $5,000 to $25,000. But they are, and again, they are reimbursable, not direct awards, and require a cash match. So please take a minute while you're working on the application to read through the guidelines, check the links to make sure that you're applying under the correct category. Our planning projects account for about 1/3 of the total applications that we receive each year, and we very much encourage applicants to use this category, especially if needed to prepare the necessary planning documents for future successful applications in the construction category. Common projects that we see, of course, are surveys, both cultural resource surveys, archaeological surveys, historic site surveys, or thematic or context surveys. They don't necessarily need to be geographically related. They can be function or association or capture location, architectural, or historic significance of a type of resource. Remember that they have to follow the current Pennsylvania SHPO guidelines for historic or cultural resource surveys, and that all data produced as part of the survey can be shared with our CRGIS system. That's very important, especially if we're making a contribution to your survey initiative. We want it to be data that we can use as well and share with the public as a whole. If you are considering a project under the survey and the planning grants, I encourage you to include a map of the area to be surveyed, the expected number of resources that will be surveyed, and a potential project timeline that will take you to complete the survey. If you're not certain or need more guidance, refer to the program fact sheet for other information that you should include in your project narrative to explain your survey methodology. We, of course, can fund National Register nominations. We encourage you to make sure that there's a recent evaluation done, perhaps within the last 5 years, by our National Register staff so that we can ensure that the project concurs with the resource's boundary and area of significance. That's very important just because you might think there's a particular boundary or area of significance. If our staff might not agree, your program budget would be off and might not be able to successfully complete your project. We certainly have a priority for historic districts over individual property nominations due to the perceived increased impact of districts over individual properties. But we do accept requests for individual property listing, especially if the applicant can make a strong case for support about why it's a good use for Commonwealth funds and will further the preservation of a particular resource. We also fund archaeological projects. Development for regional or site sensitivities or artifact analysis are typical projects that we see in this category. Remember that they have to be done in compliance with PA SHPO staff and associated guidelines. I do want to point out that we cannot use Keystone grant funding for mitigation requirements. So if you had a project that went through our environmental review and one of the stipulations was to complete an archaeological survey, unfortunately you can't use our grant funding to do that requirement under the 106 process. But we also, and probably what we see the most, are planning and development projects. They're very useful and very much encouraged. They run the gamut of regional plans or locational information projects like design guidelines or preservation plans for a community or a comprehensive plan in a county. I certainly encourage you to reach out to our community preservation coordinators of Bill Callahan, Corey Cagerais, or Brian Van Sweden if that's the direction you're going, to make sure that your project is in line with their current guidance. And then we see planning projects that are more resource associated, like a historic structures report or a preservation or conditions assessment plan for a particular building as well. Those are really helpful, especially to strengthen applications for a future construction category grant too. In the construction category, these are the grants that are true bricks and mortar grants. If you're hiring a contractor or an artisan to make a repair or a capital improvement to a building, you certainly want to apply under the construction category. Again, it must be associated with a National Register listed or eligible property and a contributing building of that listing. So unfortunately, if you're talking about demolishing a particular historic building, or a non-contributing historic building or something to that nature, it doesn't, or repairing a non-contributing building, it's not really very helpful or useful in this particular project. This category has the higher request amounts. They're $100,000. And please take note, we are a state agency, so if you receive our funding, your project will have to comply with the Pennsylvania Prevailing Wage Act, which might impact the cost of your labor. So if you're getting estimates from contractors or formulating your estimates with your design professional, you might need to factor in those budget requirements as you assemble your project estimates. But these are true construction projects, so the eligible activities include anything within the preservation, restoration, or rehab treatment standards. They're for site work, masonry, repairing or replacing doors or windows, new roofs, gutters and downspouts, or anything like that. They're meant for capital improvements above and beyond basic maintenance. If you're not sure where your project falls, you can certainly refer to the program fact sheets for a further explanation or a potential area in your budget of what's being asked for. What's not eligible, of course, is new construction, reconstruction of a missing building. We can't fund projects that are considered routine maintenance, like painting or caulking or mowing at a historic cemetery. And unfortunately, we can't be used for construction of non-historic site features, such as parking or sidewalks. Work that is covered in a planning project category, such as archaeology or pre-development work, these projects should be separated and phased in multiple fiscal years, so they can't be necessarily applied for the same round and within the same application. Unfortunately, we also cannot use our Keystone funding to acquire historic properties. I know those who might be familiar with Department of Conservation and Natural Resources grant programs, which do allow for acquisitions, but unfortunately, our Keystone grants do not. All work has to be in compliance with the Secretary's treatment of historic properties. If you're not familiar with that term, it's the set of standards that guide any kind of historic properties rehabilitation or restoration. In layman's term, it's identifying what are important features that really help you understand what that historic building is, and those features should be retained and protected during the rehabilitation. All work is reviewed prior to the commencement of construction by PHMC staff to ensure that it is compliant with the standards. I certainly encourage you that if you're applying for a section of a larger project that only a small portion is earmarked for a Keystone grant, know that the full project still has to be submitted and reviewed to ensure that the full project meets the standards. You're able to select which of the 3 treatment options your project follows, either preservation, rehabilitation, or restoration, but your application must demonstrate that it's in compliance with the standards, either in the project narrative or through the supporting documentation uploaded in the program addendum. I've included a helpful link here to what those standards are, but also if you're not really sure about the standards themselves, there's a lot of information on the National Park Service website, both for the technical preservation services that include things like, illustrated guides for the rehab standards or preservation briefs, and some certain tech notes for special aspects of a historic building as well, and I encourage you to work with that. But more importantly, I think what shows in a good project or program is that you have a design professional that is very knowledgeable in historic buildings and interpreting the standards, and who is guiding your project. And we often have comments from the grant review panel if such a professional is not part of your project team. We're also asked a lot about what makes a competitive application in our program, and I can't stress enough that you should really reach out to our grant staff or our community preservation coordinators to discuss your project over the course of the next several weeks. We certainly can make suggestions to ensure that you're thinking of all and including all the relevant information and attachments and are framing a good case for support in your application. The best applications are concise, but really do explain what's being accomplished as part of your project. For example, if it's a survey project, that you're giving an estimate number of resources that will be surveyed. Or if it's that your windows are being repaired, you explain why, what's wrong with them, and how the carpenters will make those repairs. In instances where their windows are too deteriorated to be repaired and have to be replaced, that you've shared what alternatives you considered, perhaps why they're not feasible to repair them, and show window schematics that show how your proposed window scope matches that of the historic or existing windows. I can't stress enough that well-planned projects are the ones that get funded. We also like to see projects where the sequencing is done in the proper order. For instance, since you're not repairing the decorative plaster in the interior before you identified and repaired the water leak that caused it. We like projects that are very visible and, again, primarily preservation and restoration activities. That they include estimates specifically from contractors or consultants that are included in the attachments. We do very much like projects that are visible and that will have a strong impact. That's the reason why you should carefully consider who's preparing your letters of support. These letters really demonstrate how important your project is to the community. And the review panel does read them and notice that when they're all the same form letter rather than really indicating their true support of your project. So make sure you have current letters directed to our grant review panel as a whole. They read them. I'm always surprised how often they comment on them. Remember, our panelists are not PA SHPO staff, but although our panelists are knowledgeable in preservation and restoration projects, they might not know your building as well as you do. So take a few minutes to explain why your building is significant and worthy of preservation, and how this project will further support its interpretation. The Commission wants to help projects that might not get finished without our financial commitment, or that our involvement will really make a difference in the long-term preservation of the property. And those projects that will really enhance the understanding of that historic preservation resource, or preservation in general, I guess I'm saying. Also, use photographs. I can't mention that enough. Not only a good overall photograph so we can understand the size and scale of the building, especially if it's one they might not be familiar with, but detailed photographs that explain the problem as a whole. Survey projects, what are you trying to survey? What do the buildings look like? If you're trying to repair something, what is the problem? How deteriorated are they? That's the kind of information that's very helpful. We do have some expectations of our grantees. Obviously, first and foremost, you'll have to execute a grant agreement with the Commonwealth. It's all done electronically through the portal. And remember that the project may not start before the contract is executed. The project review has to be done and approved by the PA SHPO before you start your project. And this is also very important, and I'm not sure I've mentioned this yet, but all construction projects are required to sign and execute a declaration of covenants with the Commonwealth within 40 days of the award, agreeing that all future work will be done in consultation with the PHMC and will meet the standards. That document also stipulates that the organization will keep the building open to the public and in good repair. That covenant is signed before any reimbursements are made. I am more than happy to share that document with your board of directors or any solicitors prior to you making an application so that we all understand what the obligations of the covenants are. It's absolutely non-negotiable. Grantees in the construction category will have to relinquish the grant if they're unwilling to comply with the covenant provisions. Our grantees also are asked to provide quarterly reporting to the grant manager so that we have a good understanding of how the grant is moving along, including community engagement and fundraising and press releases or any changes to the project timeline before completion. You can do reimbursements at that time, including retaining good accounting practices to substantiate all your expenses, both the grant funds and that of your match, in order to get access to your reimbursement. And finally, a final report. It shares your acknowledgement of PHMC support, either as part of the work products or through a posting of the project sign, seen here in the slide. It's imperative that you stay current on your grant administration. We do offer extensions in situations that the project can't be completed within the grant period, and it's best if our staff is privy to those challenges that you're having, rather than at the end and conclusion of your grant contract period. That was a lot of information to go over in the last couple minutes. So where you can go for additional help as you're working on your application, obviously the first place to check is the grant guidelines available on our website. You check preservation under grants and funding, both for the project category guidelines and the construction category guidelines. You can find the YouTube videos, much like you found this one, through our PA Trails of History. The one for how to navigate through the webinar is especially helpful. You're always able to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you answer questions about your project or your application. But I do encourage you, if it's related to the application itself, that you might want to reach out to Customer Service Center. They know a whole lot more about it. I've done a couple of testing and I understand what's in the application. But if it's, what's asked for here, or why isn't this saving, I do encourage you to reach out to customer service during normal business hours. I've also tried to include a lot of the helpful links within the body of the application itself, including the program fact sheet, so that you can review eligibility requirements or what's specifically asked for in particular questions. Finally, I wanted to share a section that Shelby usually does with you about our Preservation Happens Here initiative. You might recognize it as the hashtag from our preservation plan. We have been using this to kind of help engage the public with all things with the Preservation Office. We use it as well as projects are happening throughout the Commonwealth. We encourage you in social media, no matter how you're getting the word out about your project, to use the hashtag Preservation Happens Here. It's a way that we populate nominations to our SHPO Community Initiative Awards. Sometimes these are projects that might not be, immediately thought of as preservation projects, but they're great projects that we might not be aware of or involved with in our normal program area. This year's recipients were Fighters Heaven, which was Muhammad Ali's training camp in Schuylkill County, the Mahoning Drive-In in Lehighton, the Lazaretto, located not too far from Tinnakin Township in the southeast section of the state, and it was a past Keystone grantee, as well as the Roxian Theater out in McKees Rocks in Allegheny County. It's a nice way for us to stay involved in what's happening and keep a pulse of the preservation going on throughout communities. So we encourage you always to use this hashtag in any of your social media posts. You can follow our Pennsylvania PHMC social media very simply by just using the hashtag. If you're not online but still want to be including your information, just email Shelby. She can often include that within our blog posts as well to kind of help further populate information about your program as well. We anticipate our 2020 Community Initiative Awards will be announced sometime in the fall of 2020, and we'll have that information for you soon as well. I'd like to thank you again for stepping in and joining us for our webinar today. I appreciate your interest in the Keystone Grant Program. It's great to hear all of the great preservation projects happening throughout the Commonwealth, and it's great to be able to be part of your success in your community. Thanks again.